Good morning, everybody. I think we'll begin now. I'm Jennifer Manukin. I have the great luck of being the dean here at the UCLA School of Law. It's my truly tremendous pleasure to welcome you to this event, the first conference of the Center for Immigration Law and Policy at UCLA School of Law. Thank you all for tuning in today. We have a wonderful program ahead today and stretching over 3 weeks. Now, before we begin, I want to acknowledge that UCLA Law sits on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. As members of a land-grant institution, we at UCLA pay our respects to the ancestors, elders, and relatives, past, present, and emerging. Now, I understand that we have more than 400 people from all over the world registered for this virtual conference, which is fantastic. It underscores the impact that we expect the Center for Immigration Law and Policy to have in driving immigration law and policy here in Southern California and far beyond, in serving as a facilitator and an educational resource for practicing immigration advocates, for government officials, and for law students who are pursuing careers in the immigration space. We also aim to buttress UCLA Law School's mission as a public law school committed to public service. Last year, we were incredibly proud to open the center. And now, under the direction of Professor Hiroshi Motomura and now Ahilan Arunalantham, it's become the hub of many existing efforts with our other faculty members too, staff and students, all of whom take part in an array of immigration-related activities across the law school and beyond. Those include the Immigrant Family Legal Clinic at the RFK Community Schools in Koreatown, service learning trips, to help assist immigrants and refugees in Tijuana and in Texas border regions, and much more. Considering the state of national and global society and politics, I really think it's fair to say that few initiatives could be more important today than thinking hard and trying to create some spaces for innovative policy and action in the immigration space. I expect that this conference will expand on that work of thoughtful immigration, policy analysis, and legal advocacy that I also know that many of you listening participate in and contribute to as well. Over the next 3 weeks, we're going to host many eminent leaders in the field, including next Friday, Alejandro Mayorkas, the newly appointed Secretary of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. I very much hope you'll return for that and for the stellar program the week after that as well. In the meantime, I want to turn things over to Alicia Mañana to get today's program started. Alicia is one of our most distinguished graduates. She's an incredibly active alumna of UCLA Law School. She's also the co-founder with her husband, Rob Lovelace, of the Center for Immigration Law and Policy that brings us together today. And she's also the chair of my board of advisors here at the law school, and just one of my most trusted and involved advisors and friends. The Board of Advisors stands as a kind of collective voice of a number of our alums and friends. Alicia, I want to thank you for your incredible service, commitment, and dedication to UCLA Law School, and for your inspiring commitment to promoting the hard but incredibly important work of immigration law and policy here in Los Angeles and all across the nation and the world. So thank you, Alicia, for being here today. Thank you for all that you do. Let me turn things over to you to continue with the introductions.
Well, buenos dias. Good morning, everyone. And thank you, Jennifer, for such a beautiful and generous introduction. I am extremely proud that the center is convening this virtual conference as part of the center's mission. The center has launched at a time when U.S. immigration policies are shifting rapidly, and at a time when the current administration has set immigration reform as a priority. The center is a hub for scholarship already and advocacy in its very young and early years, engaging community organizations, practitioners, lawmakers, and experts in the field to develop and disseminate ideas at a local, state, national, and international levels. In supporting the center, I am hoping that lawmakers come to us for drafting policy that, simply said, that makes sense and that will provide humane solutions to the challenges seen in the past years. Being from an immigrant family myself, I feel a deep sense of responsibility and empathy toward immigrant families who want to make a better life, and for the need in this country to be inclusive of those who, for political, social, or economic reasons, struggle in their countries to find democracy and equality. UCLA Law's faculty expertise and track record of developing leaders and innovations in immigration law and policy put it in the perfect position to become a still greater force for justice at a crucial time. I am thrilled, and my husband as well, to provide resources to help the school to train UCLA students to excel at the forefront of the next generation of immigration policymakers and scholars. I am now honored to introduce Faculty Co-Director Hiroshi Motomura. Hiroshi is a teacher and a scholar of immigration and citizenship with influence across a range of academic disciplines and in federal, state, and local policymaking. His book, Americans in Waiting, The Lost Story of Immigration and Citizenship in the United States, won the Professional and Scholarly Publishing Award from the Association of American Publishers as the year's best book in law and legal studies, and was chosen by the US Department of State for its suggested reading list for foreign service officers. Professor Motomura has testified in the US Congress as recently as in the last few weeks on anti-Asian violence. He has served as co-counsel or volunteer consultant in many litigated cases and policy matters, and has been a member of the American Bar Association's Commission on Immigration. In the fall of 2008, he was an outside advisor to the Obama-Biden transition team's working group on immigration policy. He served on the board of directors of the National Immigration Law Center from 2011 through 2020. And he's one of the co-founders and current directors of the Rocky Mountain Immigrant Advocacy Network. In 2017, Hiroshi was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship for 2018 to work on a book, The New Migration Law. A preliminary article version of the project was published in the 2020 Cornell Law Review. For his collaboration on an overview of US immigration law in a completely different medium, see the Try Guys, Try Immigrating to America. I now turn it over to Hiroshi, and Hiroshi, it is really an honor that you're here convening this amazing symposium over the next 3 Fridays, and really looking forward to what comes out of the center. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Thank you very much, Alicia. We're all so grateful for your support and your inspiration, not just in the immediate past, but really over the years. And I also want to say, for those of you in the audience here today, and it's really around the world, so you were all, I was going to say good morning, but I really should say very early morning and afternoon and evening. I'm so pleased and welcome to welcome you here. With your indulgence, just a personal note, I've been planning and looking forward to this day for years, maybe even decades. As you've heard, it goes without saying that immigration is a defining issue of our time, for our city, our state, our country, our world. But it's also a very personal journey for me. It's been a defining issue of my own life, my own family, my community. My parents brought me to this country at the age of 3. But one thing I've learned over the years is, as personal as immigration is for me, and I think for many of us here today, no issue or topic can be just about ourselves. I think one of the occupational hazards of scholars, especially in universities, is to focus on our own work in isolation. And maybe the scholarship that we put into bottles and cast on the ocean will be opened by people that can make a difference. But, much more likely, the students who teach us so much will go out and do great things. But ultimately, I think that the difference we make depends on the institutions that we create, and also the culture within those institutions. And we can create those together. And that is a way to think about why we're meeting for these 3 Fridays to look at the first 100 days of the Biden administration. So ever since I came to UCLA 13 years ago, I thought it was essential that many of us at the law school who care about immigration, its faculty, staff, students, can come together and work together. And speaking of working together, this is a good moment to express our thanks to our team here at the center who've worked tirelessly on so many details for this conference that I didn't even imagine that needed to be worked on when we started to organize it. Our communications meisters, Lynn Tramonte and Haley Burgess, Wei Joan Udden, our law school events manager, and Shayla Jalali and Laura Elbaum in faculty support. And there are many others who have pitched in here and there, often consistently, and we're so grateful to you. So at this conference, as we go forward, some of our work together at the center is going to be in common cause. But I also want to say that the purpose of the center is sometimes to have challenging but essential conversations and disagreements. These are disagreements potentially about the future of immigration law and policy, about the role of immigration, immigrants in this country, this part of the world, and the entire globe. Immigration is a complicated issue, and even people who think they agree with each other don't necessarily agree with each other when it really comes down to what needs to be done. So this Center for Immigration Law and Policy reflects this vision of serious, nuanced conversation. And that it's important that at this great law school, there's a center in the most literal sense. It's a meeting place, a hub, a crossroads, a town square for ideas. So our vision is a place where the ideas generated in the academy can be brought into conversation with the world of advocacy and the making of law and policy by government officials, lawyers, organizers, and members of the community, broadly defined. And this is not just at the national level where immigration policy are often thought to be made, but it's also important to think creatively about Southern California and the West as a place to grow ideas. And it's not just to influence Washington, but it's also to help reshape this country's relationship with our neighbors in this hemisphere and to all the countries around the world. Immigration law, in many ways, is no longer immigration law. It's really the way that countries situate themselves in a global context. So you'll hear and see all this through the day-to-day and on the 2 Fridays that follow today. You'll see how each panel brings together different perspectives, often unearthing disagreements among people who might be expected to agree. So let me just say that I've been dreaming of this day, the first day of the center's first event, for well over a decade. And a big part of this dream is that someday I would stand here before you, although I didn't anticipate that it would be on a Zoom webinar, with my friend Ahilan Arulalantam to launch this venture together. Ahilan's certainly the most influential and significant immigrants' rights lawyer of his generation, having put his intellectual and advocacy stamp on some of the most central immigration issues of our time. Just to name 3 areas that are huge. One is prolonged immigration detention. Another is right to counsel for immigrants. Another is the protection of forced migrants. And those are just to name a few of the areas that Ahilan's been instrumental in shaping. He's combined imagination and tenacity in ways that all of us who know him recognized long before he received the MacArthur Foundation Fellowship several years ago. So to put it in a nutshell, Ahilan is what I want to be when I grow up. So after a decade of planning, thinking, imagining, dreaming to make this happen, I'm very pleased to welcome Ahilan to the UCLA community and to introduce him to you as my faculty co-director. Ahilan.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Hiroshi. I have to say, working with Hiroshi has been the best part of a wonderful start to my time at UCLA. Immigration issues are personal to me too. I was born in this country, but my family is from Sri Lanka, and my parents came here before the war in Sri Lanka started as a result of race discrimination and some sporadic violence. Then when I was 10 years old, the war started, and most of my extended family had to flee the country. Many of them came and lived in our house. And for me, it was a fundamental shift in my life at the age of 10, and it sort of shaped my view of my life and my work ever since. I came here to build the center with Hiroshi because I wanted to create a space for envisioning the world that we want to see as a necessary first step to producing social change. And as Hiroshi said, we want the center to be a place where people who care deeply about immigration law and policy can share their ideas on both strategy and substance. Each day of the conference reflects that. with a morning panel focused on a strategy. Today, a kind of civil disobedience, as you'll see in the Infiltrators. Next time, movement lawyering. And then the third day, political power building. And then an afternoon panel on each of those 3 days focused on an important substantive area. Today, immigration detention. Next week, asylum and humanitarian relief. And on the last day, a panel on legal status, or what some people call amnesty. Now, in the middle of each day, we'll have a one-on-one conversation with someone who can offer a unique perspective on each of the 3 branches of the federal government. Today, Cecilia Wong, a brilliant litigator on the role of the judiciary in the time to come, and the person who I would describe as the most influential immigrants' rights litigator of our generation. Next week, DHS Secretary Mayorkas, very, very excited about that. And the last day, a soon-to-be named, I wish I could spring it now, but I can't, but a soon-to-be-named highly relevant federal official from the legislative branch who we're very, very excited to have with us. I also want to use the center to deepen our appreciation for history, both the history of immigration law and policy itself, but also the history of advocates, ideas, and strategies. Knowing that history and bearing it in mind helps us to remember that the world doesn't have to be the way it is. And I think all the panels throughout the conference will give us a chance to do that. Now, before we get to all this sort of grand visioning, I have to talk about some logistics, so bear with me here for a minute. We're using Zoom webinar format. So the only people you should see on the screen will be panelists, moderators, and occasionally people who are running the conference. The Zoom link that you have, that you've tuned into, will remain open the whole day. So you can leave and come back, you can hop off and rejoin for a meeting, should be fine. But to register for days 2 and 3 of the conference, it's April 30th, next Friday, and May 7th, the Friday after that, you need to use a separate registration link available for those days. Today's Zoom link will go dead at the end of the day today. For each of the day's panels today, the Q&A is open. So we will see your questions, those of us working on the conference, but other registrants will not. During each session, some combination of the moderator and people running the conference will be reviewing those questions and trying to get them answered. Please don't be offended if your question does not get asked. We had 493 registrants for today. We currently have 200 or 199 people on here, which is fantastic. We'll do our best, but no, obviously there's a lot of people going to be asking questions. Chat is unavailable to you, but it is open. If your chat shows a message, it's probably a logistical announcement from us, from the people who are running the conference. And then the last thing, but perhaps the most important for at least several of you, we have Spanish language interpretation available for the first panel, and it's available now. One of our panelists, Claudio Rojas, who's appearing from Argentina, will be speaking in Spanish. So unless you are bilingual, you will need to pay attention to what I'm about to say. On your Zoom bar, you should see a little globe, perhaps with the word interpretation on it at the bottom. If you're joining on a phone or a tablet, it may be slightly different, but something like that. If you want to hear in English only, so in other words, you want to hear Claudio translated into English, you must go press that button and use the English channel. Si quiere escuchar en español, también oprima el botón con el mundito, the little globe down there, y elige Spanish. If you speak both languages, so you're fine hearing the panelists in whatever language that they use, then you should be able to stay put and you don't have to mess with the button, but we might be wrong. So you can always go in there and press to pick at least one language. And if you have any technical issues, please email us, cilp@law.ucla.edu. That's CILP for Center for Immigration Law and Policy at law.ucla.edu. All right, now to the good stuff. I could not be more pleased to kick off the center's inaugural conference with a discussion of the film, The Infiltrators, which tells a truly remarkable story of how undocumented immigrant youth deliberately got themselves arrested by ICE so they could be sent into detention centers, that is the immigration prisons or the immigration jails, to document that the Obama administration was detaining people who have no criminal history and try to get those people out. And as a prelude to the panel, and at risk of screwing things up here, I'm going to try to play a trailer for the film. So if you'll bear with me here, let me see if I can actually make my screen share.
Inside the matrix of 200 detention centers, almost 40,000 immigrants are locked up. They don't get a court-appointed lawyer. They don't even get a sentence. They just get warehoused. Inside, there's been cases of abuse and even mysterious death. Well, tonight, I have one question.
Hi.
How can I get in?
You're gonna be transported to a detention facility.
We're all young illegals. Our mission, stop the deportations. Our strategy, get into the detention center and get people out.
There's a woman's side to this detention center. I called my mom and my dad and I said, this is what I'm about to do. They were scared for their daughter.
Call this number with your case. They're waiting for your call.
Vamos a necesitar un cuchillo re filoso.
We can pass out a lot more phone numbers now.
Vamos a tratar de terminar 600 antes del almuerzo.
We knew there was hundreds of men that should not be in here.
You're coming with us. We're putting you on a plane. No.
I don't know what you're up to, but from now on, things are gonna be very different.
Her husband was beating her, and she finally went to the cops to turn him in. Like, she thought she was doing the right thing, and then they detained her.
They're deporting Benny. His flight leaves tonight.
I have somebody that's being deported in a couple hours. His life is in danger. Let's get them to release him.
Why were you willing to be arrested and deported to find out what was happening inside this jail?
He had already lost his family. What else does he have to lose?
We're not leaving.
Watching the film, which I did last night, nearly a decade after most of these events occurred, raises so many questions for me, and I'm sure for many people in the immigrant advocacy space. You know, was this tactic the right one, even for that time during the Obama administration, during that era? What about the harm suffered by the activists, including one of our panelists, Claudio Rojas, who you'll be hearing today from Argentina? If it was the right tactic, should people be using it now during the Biden administration? And why at that time did the infiltrators focus only on people with no criminal histories? Was that the right tactic for that era? Well, to moderate what I hope will be a fascinating discussion, we're very fortunate to have Sejal Zota, the legal director and co-founder of Just Futures Law. Sejal has litigated a number of important immigrants' rights cases over the last 20 years. One that I remember well, because she stayed at our house before doing it, was her excellent argument before the Ninth Circuit in DeMaia v. Sessions, which led to a critical due process vagueness victory, later affirmed by the Supreme Court. Now at Just Futures Law, one of Sejal's principal work areas involves litigation and advocacy to protect the First Amendment rights of immigrant activists. Her knowledge of that area makes her, in my view, the perfect moderator for this panel. Sejal, the floor is yours.
So thank you, Ahilan, my friend, for those kind words. We're all so relieved that you're okay. You gave us quite a scare. But I want to welcome everyone. We're thrilled to be the kickoff panel for this very exciting and momentous conference. As Ahilan noted, the Infiltrators film provides a historical lens for how advocacy and tactics have shifted over time as the power structures have changed. Today, across the country, immigrant communities are organizing against deportation. They're advocating for the end of immigration detention. They're demanding an end to state and local government cooperation with ICE. They're engaging in mutual aid, and they're providing a lifeline to people being civilly incarcerated by for-profit detention facilities. They have a number of demands, and President Biden is not going to satisfy all of those demands. And so I'm hoping over the next hour and a half, this esteemed panel can reflect on the lessons learned from the time of the infiltrators and how that might inform immigrants' rights advocacy under this administration and beyond. And so specifically, I'm hoping, we can talk about detention organizing and activism and how that's changed over the last decade. would the same strategies and tactics employed in the time of the film, would those be effective today? And lastly, how has ICE retaliation and repression impacted the strategies for movement building? Over the last several years, we've seen ICE specifically target people who spoke out about their cases, who are working to build power in their communities, and who are advocating for a more humane immigration policy. And so ICE attempted to silence those speaking out because ICE viewed this organizing as a threat to enforcement, as a threat to the power structure, and as a threat to their very existence, right? And so, I also want to hear from this panel about, how do communities and advocates counter ICE retaliation going forward? Leadership has changed, but the boots on the ground have not. So I'd like to introduce our esteemed panelists. We have Luis Nolasco, who was one of the original Infiltrators back in 2012, and now is a senior community engagement and policy advocate at the ACLU of Southern California. He was one of the co-founders of the Inland Empire Immigrant Youth Collective and currently sits on the board of the Inland Coalition for Immigrant Justice. His work is focused on the intersections between the criminal justice and immigration systems, and over the last decade has been active in the fight to dismantle the collaboration between local law enforcement and immigration authorities, as well as the fight against mass incarceration in the inland valleys. And Luis was a leading force in the effort to eliminate 287G agreements locally and played a key role in organizing the statewide campaign for the California Values Act. We have Alina Das, Professor Alina Das with us today, one of the leading attorneys defending movement activists against retaliation by ICE. She's a professor of clinical law at the NYU School of Law and co-director of the Immigrants' Rights Clinic, a leading institution in local and national struggles for immigrants' rights. She and her students represent immigrants and community organizations in litigation at the agency, federal court, and Supreme Court level, and in immigrants' rights campaigns at the local, state, and national level. In addition to her teaching, Alina engages in scholarship on deportation and detention issues, particularly at the intersection of immigration and criminal law. And prior to joining the law school, Alina was a Soros Justice Fellow with the Immigrant Defense Project and a clerk for Judge Lopez of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the First Circuit. She's a recipient of numerous awards for advocacy and teaching. And last, we have Claudio Rojas, one of the stars of the Infiltrators film. 21 years ago, Claudio and his family traveled from Argentina to the United States on a tourist visa. And after Claudio was offered a job in Florida, he and his family members spent years trying to address their immigration status. And in 2012, after more than a decade of living, working, and raising his children here, Claudio ended up in the Broward County Detention Center. As we saw in the film, Claudio, in conjunction with a group of DREAM activists, they built a campaign demanding that detainees be freed, launched a hunger strike, and earned national media attention, moving 26 members of Congress to sign a letter demanding an investigation. Claudio received temporary work authorization, applied for a visa, checked in with ICE under both the Obama and Trump administrations. And then in January of 2019, just weeks after the Infiltrators premiered at the Sundance Film Festival, Claudio was suddenly deported. ICE falsely accused him of crimes, although it was clear that the true motivation was to punish him for speaking out. So let's get this conversation started. I'd like to start with the topic of detention organizing that featured so prominently in the film. And this first question is for Luis. Organizing in immigration detention centers has a long history. For example, if we look at the case of the Northwest Detention Center in the state of Washington, immigrants caged there have organized more than 15 hunger strikes over several years to highlight inhumane conditions. They filed numerous complaints. And with the collaboration from undocumented immigrant activists of La Resistencia, their years of organizing resulted in the passage of House Bill 1090 by the state legislature just earlier this month, which is expected to lead to the effective closure of the Northwest Detention Center. Luis, can you talk about how some of the demands and goals of detention organizing have evolved over time? For example, in 2012, the National Immigrant Youth Alliance was focused on getting a subset of people released. But today, many organizations are working to end immigration detention altogether. Can you talk to us about that evolution in demands as well as your current detention work?
Sure, happy to. And thanks, everybody. Glad to be here today and participating in this panel. Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of detention organizing, and I think the immigrant rights movement and as a whole, right, it's come really far from where we were in 2012 when this movie and when all of the actions that we took in Broward kind of happened. I think the most important thing to note, right, is that like, I think worthwhile to acknowledge that sort of it's okay to recognize that maybe our positions and the way that we approach the work was probably wrong. And that's, I think, one of the most important lessons that I learned in doing this work. I call it very similarly to the what we did in the detention space was very similar to what happened in like the Dream Act space, right? Because what we ended up doing was we were pushing for a subset of group that seemed to be more quote unquote palatable for the general public, right? Dreamers or people without criminal convictions, as we did in the 2012 Broward organizing. And what that did is that only furthered this like good versus bad immigrant narrative that is so prevalent now, that I think that's really hindered us in pushing for these broad sort of asks that we're making throughout the country, really to protect the people that are the most vulnerable, right? The ones that are always excluded and maybe don't have as much immigration relief available to them. So people with felony convictions, people that serve time in state prisons, people that have various reentry on the records. So protecting those, I think is sort of like the lesson learned, right? That like we failed to protect the most criminalized. And I think that's sort of what we're reckoning with, right? Is that the narratives and what we pushed for in those years, in a way, reinforce those stereotypes and those narratives, that now we're facing this huge obstacle, right? Of trying to break that down because of everything that we were sort of pushing for in 2012. So for me, that's like the biggest lesson learned, right? Is that we kind of, excuse the language, right? But like we kind of fucked up a little bit in the way, in our approach to that. And I think now, and you know, I think a lot of folks in the immigrant rights organizing, especially immigrant detention, have really leaned into abolition and really looked at our partners that are doing this sort of defund abolition work with public institutions, right? Just because they're private doesn't mean if we abolish them, that public institutions are okay, right? So I think a lot of us have really learned from the folks doing this work to end state prisons and county jails. All forms of incarceration are evil. And so I think that synergy and those lessons learned have really sort of in a way strengthened a lot of us doing this work. And so for me, that's something that I've really gained. And I think a lot of our community partners and organizations doing this work have kind of really leaned into abolition and taking some notes from folks doing this work that have been doing this work against prisons and jails for years. Locally, I mean, I think some of my detention work now, I got my sort of like interest in detention being in Broward, right? Just seeing the conditions inside the facility and just how evil immigrant detention is. Having spent time in one facility myself, I think it just sort of my passion, right? It's just ending all incarceration. And I'm lucky to be able to work on both of the sides, right? Like trying to fight against county jails and state prisons and immigrant detention centers at the same time, because they're all often in the same place. In Adelanto, there's like a federal prison, there's a state, there's a county jail, and there's an immigration detention center, all like in a 15-mile radius, right? So they build them all together anyways. But a lot of our work really has been focused on shutting down the Adelanto Detention Center. It's one of the biggest detention facilities in the country that just recently added 750 beds. And so in this time where we're calling for a decrease in ICE spending, we're calling for an abolishment of ICE detention, ICE is finding ways in sort of going around and continuing to increase the detention space. And so our sort of collective work here locally with the shutdown and focus on once and for all, let's shut it down, right? Like now is the time, we have the opportunity, we have the momentum. COVID-19 really showed, right? Like that detention is not necessary. We have the lowest levels of people in detention ever. And so it really shows that there is another way possible, right? So let's use this momentum, let's take this advantage, and just let's get rid of it together altogether. So yeah, that's kind of some of the stuff that's happening locally.
Hear, hear. This next question is for Claudio. Immigrants in detention who participate in hunger strikes or otherwise seek more humane conditions often experience retaliation, including physical violence and solitary confinement. What is your message to people in detention now who are trying to fight the conditions they're facing? Yes, immigrants in detention who participate in hunger strikes or otherwise seek more humane conditions often experience retaliation, including physical violence and solitary confinement. What is your message to those people in detention right now who are trying to fight the conditions that they're facing?
Bueno, como estaba diciendo Luis, todo lo que nosotros empezamos a iniciar era nuevo, un terreno nuevo. ¿Ahora estoy bien? Bueno, como decía Luis, todo lo que nosotros empezamos a hacer era nuevo para explorar. Entonces, el mensaje que yo tengo para los inmigrantes que ahora están haciendo huelga de hambre y cosas así, la represalia ya de por sí la van a seguir teniendo desde el momento que caen en manos de ICE. Pero bueno, lo importante es que ellos sean unidos, tanto interno como externo, sigan esta lucha unidos para que de esa forma, supongamos cuando hacen una huelga de hambre o un ayuno religioso, lo que sea, es notorio la ausencia en los comedores, desayuno, entonces ellos es un nombre significante de que algo está pasando en el centro de detención, entonces dan alerta, y cuando se une con la gente de afuera y sale afuera a los medios, llama la atención de la prensa, en lo que de esa forma ese movimiento que se está haciendo causa un efecto al público más efectivo, entiende que no es algo que se queda ahí adentro, sale afuera, entonces hay que hacerlo, pero hay que hacerlo organizadamente para que no tener tanta represión como el aislamiento o directamente moverlo de un centro a otro centro para que no lo aíslen, como el caso mío. En el caso mío, cuando yo hice un ayuno de 30 días, ellos dijeron que era huelga de hambre, pero fue un ayuno religioso. Entonces tomaron la iniciativa de tomar una represión conmigo. Primero, aislarme. Segundo, no dejarme salir a los pasillos con los demás detenidos, simplemente me dejaban salir 10 minutos y acompañado de un oficial cuando ya no había nadie, como si fuera un delincuente. O sea, tomaban mucha represión conmigo, no me permitían tener visitas. Entonces, para que no suceda eso, cuando se hace, hay que tratar de hacerlo con la más masa posible de los detenidos, más unión, porque en el caso mío fue individual. Entonces tomaron mucha represalia, hasta me llevaron a una cárcel federal. Me sacaron de Pompano Beach, me llevaron a una cárcel federal y me tuvieron encerrado en una sala de hospital, pero de enfermos de tuberculosis, para que nadie, ni siquiera los guardias se querían acercar conmigo. Así que para evitar esa represión, yo le diría que si lo hacen, lo hagan organizado y en masa.
Thank you, Claudio. That's very helpful So this next question is for Alina. Alina, you have written of the cruelty and humanity of our immigration system. Since its inception, ICE has routinely violated human rights and proven to be an immoral, unaccountable, and dangerous agency. Can you describe for us how that abuse ramped up under the Trump administration, and whether, you know, we heard Luis talking about abolition and how demands, at least around detention, have changed over time. And I'm wondering whether you think that that sort of increased abuse makes a case for a bolder approach now in terms of the movement's demands and its vision of justice.
Thank you, Sejal, for the question. And I have to say at the beginning, Claudio, it's so beautiful to see your face and hear your words. And we'll talk more about this, but I had the unfortunate circumstance of learning about Claudio at one of the most horrific moments of his life and what his family is going through. And that is the retaliation that you faced because of your advocacy. And we all owe you a real debt of gratitude for being so brave and so outspoken about what you've seen for yourself, but also really for others. So it's a real privilege to be with you and to be with you, Luis and Sejal, all real warriors in this movement. So to answer your question, Sejal, I guess at the outset, I'd like to emphasize, as we all know, the abuses that we've seen in this system are part of its very design, are part of its very foundation. I think as a student of history, it's important to remember our very first immigration and citizenship laws in this country were explicitly designed to be racist. Citizenship naturalization rights were only given to free white persons. Every new step in the bureaucracy that we see today, every building block in the beginning was explicitly racist and xenophobic. So we know that the foundations themselves are designed to exclude and exploit and punish people of color, people who come to this country who seek a better life, but don't fit the whiteness that much of the foundations of this country were designed to preserve. And nothing that we see today across any administration has been a real shift from that. There are new justifications for our immigration laws, new justifications for detention, for deportation that are less explicitly racist, but they are built on that foundation and they still have that effect. So those abuses we've seen in every administration are by design. And I think that draws towards the point that Luis was making about the need for abolition, for truly transformative change, that you can't just tinker around the edges and expect change. But it is true that in tinkering around the edges, different administrations have, always because organizing has demanded it, never as a handout, but really because it was demanded of them, different administrations have created some policies that have been helpful, that have allowed for material differences in people's lives. And that's what I think the Infiltrators showed so beautifully. You know, in that moment of the Obama administration, there was a demand coming from immigrant communities that the increase in deportations that President Obama really put into place, the criminalization, was really unacceptable. And, you know, organizers really pushed back against that and demanded change. And you had an administration that was willing to some extent to be held accountable. And that is why what Claudio and Luis and all of the other people in the Infiltrators, what they did was so powerful because they exposed the hypocrisy of what was happening inside. And their voices, to some extent, were heard. What we saw under the Trump administration, and I think many of us remember some of the early press briefings from the White House where they made this very clear, that the policy was now to, quote, take the shackles off ICE officers, immigration and customs enforcement officers. And with that new policy, they made it very clear under the Trump administration that they were not only going after the bodies of immigrants, the families of immigrants, they were going after their voices, that they were going to use every tool in their toolbook to make sure that immigrants would be taken out of this country. And that included fighting against those, targeting those who spoke out and spoke up for their rights. And I think that that is what we saw in Claudio's case. I, again, had the privilege of getting to know Claudio and his family, but under the most terrible circumstances. In 2019, we saw the Infiltrators premiere at Sundance, an incredible showing and celebration of the importance of organizing and organizing in detention at a moment where our communities really needed to hear that message. And what happened to Claudio at his very next ICE check-in? ICE came and targeted him. They arrested and detained him. They gave these false statements, as you noted in the beginning of this presentation, to try and justify their actions. And they later admitted they were false. And that timing, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, it really exposed just how vulnerable our immigrant rights leaders are in this current system when you have an administration that cannot even be shamed. And so those abuses, again, as I said, they've existed from the beginning. They're part of the design of the immigration system. But under the Trump administration, they certainly came out in full force, in full sight. And when you know that it's not even, the message that they send is that it's not even, whether you came here, how you came here, whether you have the quote unquote right to be here under our laws that matter. They want to silence people's voices, that when you appear in a film criticizing the government, that government will come and take you out of this country. That is a chilling message, exactly as it was designed. And so many people, Claudio and his family, first and foremost, have been fighting against those abuses, and talk more about that. But I think it does demonstrate the need for fundamental change, right? We have to right the wrongs of the Trump administration, to be sure, bringing back Claudio being first on the list. But in addition to that, we have to create a system where immigrants' voices are protected and amplified, where we listen to what the community is telling us about the harms of the system, and we don't use jails and prisons and deportation as ways of addressing the issues that come with mobility and movement and migration, which are beautiful things that are part of what makes our world a thriving place. And so those kinds of fundamental change require abolitionist thinking. They require bolder changes, and that's what I think communities are pushing for today.
Thank you. This next question is for both Claudio and Luis. And we can start with Claudio. Let's say, this is sort of, I think, what Ahilan was getting at earlier. Let's say President Biden does not release everyone in detention or abolish detention centers. And we know that ICE will be detaining people who do not come within the new enforcement priorities, right? That there will be this disjunct between the policies and what's actually happening on the ground. So, should people in the movement infiltrate detention centers once again? Or do the lessons of the last decade counsel against infiltrating in the jails? And I think second, for both of you, what organizing strategies will be effective in stopping deportations and getting this administration to engage in the short term and in building power over the long term to defeat our racialized immigration system? So Claudio, if we could hear from you first, that would be great.
Bueno, si deberían infiltrarse o no infiltrarse otra vez, porque puede ser contraproducente, pero bueno, sí se necesitan cambios específicos para los inmigrantes, ¿no? Porque no hay oficinas donde un inmigrante pueda presentarse a denunciar abusos. Entonces, al no haber oficinas, el inmigrante tiene temor de la represalia, porque actualmente hasta la policía está colaborando con ICE, entonces que hasta se cierra en sí mismo y sufre los abusos que está sufriendo. Sí, se necesitarían buenos cambios específicamente abrir un centro donde el inmigrante pueda expresarse sin temor a la represalia de ser deportado. Y, bueno, eso sería lo que mi parecer.
And Luis, can we hear from you?
Yeah. Excuse me. Oh man, this is such a I have like such a conflicting sort of viewpoint to this, right? Because for me personally, right, like I think it comes with an acknowledgement that this, like the ability to infiltrate comes with a certain level of privilege, right? Because a lot of people that are detained and are arrested, like it happens through sort of what they've done and like the system is doing what it's meant to do, right? And so it comes with a certain level of privilege that I think I've been sort of still, you know, in the past few years, like just acknowledging that, right? Like we did this knowing that we had this privilege of being quote unquote dreamers, right? And that was our sort of ticket to get out. But then the other thing is, I mean, at least for me, right? Like my whole life being undocumented in this country, I've grown up with this fear of like worst case scenario for me has always been, what if I get deported? That's, you know, like hashtag PTSD, you know, immigrant trauma. But doing this experience in a way kind of helped me fight that fear. Like what's the worst thing that you can do? You can send me to an immigrant detention center, and what am I gonna do? I'm gonna start talking to people, start organizing on the inside and like fighting for changes. And like, if they want to deport me, well, so be it. Like, you know, so in a way, it's kind of weird that it kind of took away that fear from me and it kind of like lit a match under me. But also recognizing, like I said, right, it comes with a huge level of privilege, and it also comes with a huge level of like sort of consequences that come with spending time in detention. I mean, the sort of emotional trauma and toll that it takes on you. I mean, that's something that, you know, I've been sort of dealing with ever since sort of my infiltration, right, of like how to deal with the sort of trauma of having spent time in detention. That, you know, I wouldn't wish upon anybody, and it kind of feels hard for me to say, like, I don't like to tell undocumented people what they should and shouldn't be doing, right? My sort of role is like to guide and provide the tools necessary for them to be their own advocates, right? And if folks feel like infiltrating is a tactic, I can be like, well, look, I can share what my experience, what happened to me, like how I've had, you know, I have an open case that's administratively closed, you know, just share all of that and let them make their own decision. But I mean, I don't know if it's going to work again, right? Like, I think over the past 10 years, we've seen certain tactics change and develop and certain things not working. Like in the time of 2012, prosecutorial discretion was our go-to, and we were doing a lot of petitions, and that sort of seemed to be working. Not to say it doesn't work, but I feel like those tactics just require so much more now, and so much more pressure and so much more community support, right? Because it kind of became not the norm, but, you know, I think everybody kind of caught on to like this sort of community collective defense campaign sort of model, right? And so, I mean, what's going to take for us to stop more deportations in the coming years? I mean, I think I've always been a big sort of advocate of the sort of saying of like less allies, more accomplices, right? Like, I think we need to be ready to throw down at any moment to protect our community. Sort of not being afraid of the consequences. Like, I was so encouraged and I loved seeing, I think it was in New York, right? Where folks intercepted the ICE van, right? And they just like, the community gathered and all around the van, and the van couldn't go anywhere. And like I think they ended up letting the person out, if I'm correct, I don't remember, but sort of more actions like that, right? Of like, what are the ways that we can disrupt the system to make sure that our community is protected, but also like continuing to support, like I said, the most criminalized, right? Because those are the folks that always get the least amount of support and sympathy from the general public. And so like, let's stop like worrying about what the person did and all of that. Like everybody's deserving of freedom, and like we should be fighting for everybody, and not just because of somebody's, convictions or whatever. Like that shouldn't be the reason why we're not helping them, right? If we're really working toward this abolitionist goal, right, we need to like welcome everybody and like have this conversation about like making sure that we protect everybody and we don't let anybody behind.
So speaking of, abolitionist goals, we got a question from the audience. What would the three of you say to people who believe immigration detention is wrong, but don't believe all prisons should be abolished? Is there room in our movement for people like that, who have that viewpoint?
I mean, I can just share briefly, and then I'll stop because I feel like I'm talking too much. I say yes. I mean, personally, right? Like, I think everybody has sort of developed their own political theory throughout the years, right? Like, I don't think we all landed on this sort of like abolish everything kind of position, right? Like, I think everybody sort of gets there, and it's through like education and like reading books and this and this and that. And for me, that's what sort of the way that I got here. Like, I'm sure at one point or another, I was like, oh yeah, you can't close prisons, right? Like in 2010, right? I'm sure I had a position like that. That it just takes like education and working with community and like providing that information to them. And I think that the crucial part is sometimes theory is so dense and so heavy. And so the conversation is like, how do we make sure that we're providing this information to the general public in ways and concepts that they can understand, so it doesn't become like sort of like very academia-y. And I like to think of like, what are the ways that I can explain this to my parents? if my parents wouldn't understand, I don't think I'm doing a good job of explaining this, right? And so I think that's the most important, is just like having patience and working with people and like providing text. I think that's been really helpful. Providing books, like starting somewhere, right?
Alina or Claudio, do you guys have thoughts on that?
Tina, creo que sería la mejor, la más recomendada.
Well, I'm sure what I've learned from Claudio and others, but I think what I've really, so I do believe that everyone has a place in the movement, that we can all learn from each other and our perspectives, and that having questions about visions, goals, tactics is okay. And it shouldn't stop anyone from trying to join coalitions and participate in trying to do what justice you think can be done, particularly on a local level, because there are all sorts of problems and you have to start somewhere. But I will say that I am personally an abolitionist who believes that all prisons, in my perfect vision of the world, would be over, that we wouldn't have to rely on them. And I think that to me is the key question. It's hard, sometimes it's hard for people to imagine many people being supportive of abolition, but for me, it's hard to imagine anyone who would say that they want to live in a world where physically imprisoning people behind cement blocks or bars is necessary, right? Don't we all want to live in a world where you don't need that, where there's no purpose that is served by harming someone in that way? Because I think we do know today, in today's day and age, that prisons, whether it's in the immigration context, in the criminal context, they are producers of harm, right? So they physically are separating families, they're isolating people. I don't know a single person who entered a jail or detention center and came out healthier or happier than they were when they began. Any services and any progress people have made is because of their own resilience and because others came inside those walls and tried to provide access to treatment or education against all the odds, right? So the prisons aren't designed to provide that. And the good that has come from people's work is the work that they've done on themselves and with each other. And that is something that we can provide outside of prison walls. So if you believe that you can be a person who would like to see a world where we didn't need it, and you're just not sure how we get from here to there, that's the place to start to me, because abolitionists, and I think Luis referenced, there are a lot of people who've written a great deal of very accessible material about how to think about abolition, how to practice it, how to find small ways to build that kind of world. They always emphasize that abolition isn't about ending things or just tearing walls down. It's really about building something new, a new way of how we treat each other, of how we support each other, how we build a world where people can thrive. And this obsession that we have in this country with punishment is really something that we can let go of, because we realize it's harming us far more than it ever helps. So I think that vision is something that if you can see an entry point, I think you should walk right in and try and explore what that means for you, whether it's a local fight to close a jail or a detention center in your area, whether it is a support for state legislation and federal efforts to shift, billions of dollars that go into the system away from it and into the kinds of services and supports that we actually need to avoid being in these circumstances to begin with. Whatever that cause may be, I think it's good to explore it, and then you can allow yourself to evolve and think through, okay, I can see a path to a world where we would never need a cement building, a barbed wire, a wall to feel safe and secure, and recognize that those cement buildings and barbed wires and walls actually make people feel very unsafe and insecure. So hopefully, I think everybody has a place in that journey, and questions are perfectly okay.
Thank you, guys.
Yo estoy de acuerdo con Alina, pero puedo hablar de mi experiencia, que yo no veo justo una persona que no tenga récord criminal, pero no es un criminal, y el único pecado que ha cometido es tratar de salir adelante con su familia y buscar un nuevo futuro para sus hijos, con mucho esfuerzo de trabajo, tener que pasar a la posición de ser detenido y esposado de pies y manos, como si fuera un verdadero criminal. Por eso yo no estoy de acuerdo que los centros de detención, que les llaman centros de detención, los hagan como cárceles. Pienso que no debería ser así, especialmente para un detenido de proceso de inmigración, que no es un delincuente. Yo creo que sí, que esos centros de detenciones tendrían que desaparecer y buscar nuevas formas de tratar del tema de la inmigración.
Thank you, Claudio. So I think building on, I think you guys have been talking about sort of, some of the lessons learned from the infiltrators, and you've presented a number of questions of, whether that would be an effective strategy today. Someone from the audience, I guess, was sort of pushing back on that a little and asking if, whether you think the infiltrators was more successful because they focused only on people with no criminal history, and if the message at the time had been abolish all detention, would it have been as successful?
Well, I am probably the least, prepared to answer the question, since I'm the person here who did not live through the experience of really organizing through the Infiltrators. But I obviously was doing immigrant rights work at the time. And I think this is a common, it's a common question or tension that arises in a lot of movement work. So we hear it right now in other abolitionist movements. For example, responses to police violence and the killing of Black people in this country, the debate over whether the proper framing should be defund the police or should it be some sort of reform. And so I think it's an important question to recognize. But I do agree with those who take the longer view and say, the question is really how we build the world we want to see. And tactically, it's sure thinking about what a particular administration will be open to in that moment may allow more success for the individuals whose cases you're uplifting, for a specific call to close one facility or to free a group of people. And the people who are directly impacted and who are leading that work will make calls about that all the time. But in the long term, given the fact that all of that organizing work, which was tremendous. I mean, it is activists like Louise and others who really got us DACA and other forms of like these protections that have made a meaningful difference in the lives of hundreds of thousands of people in this country. But they are also the ones who are telling us that that is not the goal. The goal ultimately is to really push back against a system that has the power to detain and deport so many people and separate so many families. And so you can look back at these moments and say, yes, there was tremendous success using this good versus bad immigrants frame, that it worked with some entities, some political officials were more open to hearing that. But then you step back and look at the statistics. The number of deportations and detentions has only risen through this period. So there's success in some new programs, there's success in individual cases with that kind of framing, but over time, the system has continued to balloon. The only reason that there are a smaller detention population today is really because of some of Trump's border policies and the impact of COVID-19 on immigration enforcement. And we're at a real moment now where we could either see the system grow right back up to where it was as hopefully COVID-19 is under more control and that public health crisis is alleviated. We'll either see detentions just go back up to where they were and deportations, or we could take this opportunity, seeing such a small number of people, relatively speaking, in detention and say it's time to close these facilities down and end detention authority now. And to get there, to get to that real dramatic shift, you need true transformative change. And that's where I think the good versus bad immigrant narrative that Luis was talking about earlier is very harmful, because by admitting or believing or saying that only some people deserve freedom, you are saying that there are some people who don't deserve it, and therefore we need jails, we need detention, we need deportation officers. And that's the justification that allowed deportations to skyrocket under the Obama administration. He still holds the record within his first term, even compared to Trump, of deporting the most people from this country. The Obama administration has that record. You have to see, what is the justifications, the stories we tell ourselves that allow a system like that to exist. And so for that reason, even though it's harder, even though tactically in a moment, it may not feel like the right thing to do, having an abolitionist call that says free them all, I believe is much more powerful long-term to seeing a world where we don't have immigration detention. But it is a rich question, and it's occurring in all sorts of different movement goals. And so I'm really grateful for the person who asked it.
Thanks for breaking that down, Alina. This is a question from the audience for Luis. From your lessons learned, what is your message right now to immigrant youth leaders who are organizing in the movement?
Yeah, I'm like, oh no, I'm no longer a youth. I think I passed that age already. It's crazy to think I started as a youth. I'm not a youth anymore. I think the biggest issue, not issue, but the biggest sort of way that immigrant youth can continue to play a key role is, like I said earlier, right? Like, I think there's a huge amount of sort of privilege and like, I don't want to say clout, but like America, right? Like dreamers have been like this thing, right? Like everybody's like, oh, dreamers, protect the dreamers, and like, I think there's something there, right? Of like using this privilege that we have as this like group to make sure that we're fighting for everybody, right? And that this community doesn't sort of easily accept these piecemeal approaches that kind of Alina just talked about, right? Of like, oh, well, yeah, let's do this small thing that will protect undocumented youth, but we'll criminalize everybody else, right? Or like we'll increase border funding. So I think that's like the biggest lesson I've learned, right? It's like, this is the sort of tactics that the institution sort of plays, right? It's like, let's give a little piece to them for this. We'll get their input, we'll get their buy-in, they'll support us, and then we'll criminalize the rest. And I think that's just been so harmful. And I mean, we haven't even been able to get any of that, right? So it's just, I think that's like probably the best piece of advice is just really lean into what folks are asking. And like, I encourage immigrant youth especially to really lean in and take sort of an ear and I guess get the calling orders from people that are doing organizing on the police brutality, police abolition side, right? Like Black organizers throughout the country have been holding it down. And like, I think it's important, right, that our immigrant youth sort of listen to what they're asking for and like join in that sort of movement, right? I think we're not going to get to this ultimate goal unless we all start working with each other and abolish these sort of like invisible silos that sometimes we create in movement spaces of like, I work on immigration, I work on police, I work on jails, right? I think we need to start sort of collaborating and seeing how all the issues relate, because at the end of the day, we're all being criminalized for being Black and brown, right? And so we all have the same common goal, same common enemy at the end of the day. And I think that's the sort of what I would share. And at least I'm hopeful for the Generation Z because they've been on it. So I don't have any fear that they are going to be doing amazing things. Like their asks and the way that they've been organizing have really been so bold, and I'm so appreciative of the youth.
I love that advice. I'm part of Gen X, and I think we can learn from you too. So, so I want to shift the conversation a little bit and turn to retaliation. Claudio, we've heard a lot about your story from Alina and from some of the introductory remarks, but can you please share with us your story of how you came to be targeted and how that has harmed you, your family, and your community?
Y bueno, especialmente a mi comunidad, yo soy miembro de una iglesia, lo cual era el que reemplazaba al pastor cuando él tenía que viajar. Entonces, lo que es mi círculo cristiano fue muy impactado de eso. Lo que es mi familia, el sufrimiento grande de la deportación, yo ya me encontraba en amenaza de deportación, fue catastrófico, tanto para mi esposa y para mis hijos. No sé si estoy contestando bien la pregunta. porque no lo alcancé a entender bien. ¿Me lo podría repetir otra vez?
Yeah, I just wanted to hear more about, your story of being targeted for deportation and the kinds of harms that has caused to you and your family and your community.
Bueno, yo fui objeto por intermedio de la película Infiltrados. Ahí yo fui objeto de la deportación porque yo venía por varios años presentándome en el centro de detención, tanto en la época de la presidencia de Obama y Trump, y no hubo problema en la visita que hacía de supervisión. Pero el objeto mío para la deportación empezó cuando la película se estrenó y ya mi nombre salió registrado de que era Claudio Rojas, que sea ese documental, entonces ya fui objeto a la detención y deportación. En el día que yo me presento, mi visita rutinaria, todos los años me presentaba y después empezaron cada 6 meses cuando cambió la administración. Fueron más repetitivas las visitas. Yo me presentaba con una petición de visas y mi abogado, en lo cual me hicieron esperar como 5 horas y de un momento a otro me hicieron pasar para la oficina adentro y por orden administrativa me tenían que detener. Eso fue en el momento de que ellos se enteraron que la película había sido estrenada y galardonada. Días antes yo había pedido un permiso para viajar a Utah para ver el festival, pero denegaron. Un tiempo más adelante la película iba a ser presentada en Miami y bueno, yo ya estaba por ver la película en Miami cuando me tocó la fecha de mi supervisión. Bueno, en ese momento que me presenté, me detuvieron automáticamente. Imagínense todas las ilusiones que yo tenía con mi familia. Fue algo muy impactante. Esa mañana despedirme de mi esposa como una visita rutinaria. Ya vengo, voy a volver y al pasar el tiempo que no venía, y bueno, hasta que se enteró mi esposa la noticia que había sido detenido y bueno, todo fue por la represalia que tomaron, me agarraron como objeto. En ese momento me agarraron a la deportación.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Claudio. I know it must not be easy to talk about, but we just appreciate everything, all the sacrifices that you've made and everything that you're doing to fight back and to organize against this terrible repression and these terrible policies.
Para mí es volver a recordar ese pasado, para mí es muy difícil. Me causó mucho sufrimiento. Más, después de 7 meses de estar detenido, volver a reunirme con mi familia era sentarme toda la mañana en la cama y mirar el piso, porque no había causado un impacto. Mi esposa, no sé, era como que había un vacío, quedaba un vacío el vacío de cuando uno se sentaba en el centro de detención en la cama pensando qué pasará con el mañana. Ese es el impacto y ahora actualmente me cuesta mucho volver a revivir lo sucedido, ¿no? Porque la lucha mía fue al ver las injusticias que estaban sucediendo en ese centro de detención y y ver a hombres ya mayores llorar por el sufrimiento de su esposa, de sus hijos que dejaba, de todo lo que habían emprendido, de quedarse atrás, ¿entiendes? Entonces me cuesta mucho volver a recordar todo eso, porque cuando yo empiezo a hablar del tema es como que vuelvo al pasado. Pero bueno, hay que hablarlo, ¿no? Yo, como te digo, siempre dije, no hay que callarse, así como empezó un movimiento en ese centro de detención, y si lo tengo que hablar, aunque me cueste, lo tengo que hablar y no me tengo que callar. Lo voy a seguir hablando.
Well, we very much appreciate your powerful voice and your willingness to share with us. Alina, you represent a number of targeted immigrant activists, including Claudio, Ravi Ragbir, Jean Montalval, the sanctuary leaders. And could you describe for us, like how big is this problem? How many people has ICE retaliated against? And can you describe for us some of the ways in which ICE retaliates against individuals who speak out and against grassroots groups who engage in bold immigrants' rights advocacy and organizing?
Sure. And so for me, for many years, my main focus as an immigrant rights attorney was representing people facing deportation, detention, as part of everyday enforcement of immigration law. And the reason I got involved in these issues in particular is because I had been representing an individual for about 10 years who had been detained and then was released on an order of supervision, but was still fighting his case. And I came on board to represent him in that fight. And he, over time, after being released from detention, much like Claudio, was changed by the experience. And he became an activist and became involved in the New Sanctuary Coalition. And so this is the individual you mentioned, Ravi Ragbir. And so I had been representing him on his immigration case in my area of expertise, which is immigration and criminal law, for many years. And as he rose, living his life in prominence as an activist, we really saw the same thing happen, this what became this new pattern under the Trump administration, where it was very common for us to attend his check-ins with ICE, with many individuals, elected officials, faith leaders. Community support is something that the New Sanctuary Coalition really prided itself on, and really making sure that people were present to bear witness to what immigrants go through every day. And we had been doing that for many years, and under the Obama administration, again, because of public pressure, Ravi and others were granted stays. They were given permission to be here. The voice of the community was respected to an extent. And that changed under the Trump administration. And in 2018, ICE launched a joint operation to detain and deport both Ravi and then Jean Montalval, another individual you mentioned, who was a friend of mine, but I wasn't representing at the time, but who was a co-founder of New Sanctuary Coalition. So they come up with this operation on the same day to arrest these two men whose only thing in common is that they're both leaders of the New Sanctuary Coalition. They both have spoken out against ICE. And they denied at the time that they were doing anything other than going about business as usual. But we all knew as the community that something was wrong, that this was wrong on the levels. It's always wrong when a person is deported, but they were clearly trying to send a message to our community, the immigrant rights community in New York City, that they weren't going to tolerate our rallies and our vigils and our criticism of the agency. And so in Ravi's case, that's when I pivoted along with my colleague Jessica Rofe, our students, and Arnold and Porter, a law firm, which really jumped in to come up with this First Amendment lawsuit, really calling ICE out on what it was doing as First Amendment retaliation. And that lawsuit ultimately culminated in a favorable appeals decision in New York, recognizing that what happened to Ravi was outrageous discrimination. But it took many months, many years. And as you can imagine, the government is still fighting it, got the Supreme Court to overturn it, and we're still in a battle about what it means going forward. But after that happened, Ravi was given a stay, and he still has a stay pending all of this. That was in 2018, and then it's 2019. Ravi sends me an article. It's an article from the Miami Herald, and it's talking about Claudio being detained after the premiere of The Infiltrators. And Ravi texted me and said, "You have to help this man." And so that is how many of us, along with Rapid Defense Network and the Immigration Clinic at University of Miami, we got together to file the same lawsuit in Claudio's case. And I think it really demonstrates how shallow the protections are, because even this was an obvious case of First Amendment retaliation. The film premieres, and as Claudio mentions, the next check-in, he's detained and arrested. The reasons they gave for it, they admitted, are false. They've never explained it. The only explanation of the change is that there was this film criticizing ICE. And so in any other circumstances, that would be clear retaliation, clear remedy. But for immigrants, the court didn't even think it had the power to intervene. So the lower court said no, all of our emergency stays were denied and Claudio was deported. We still pursued the appeal. That appeal is pending. We believe that the right thing to do on every level, starting with the First Amendment of our Constitution on down, is for Claudio to be returned to the position he was in before this retaliation occurred. And we're still fighting that battle in the courts. But now with the new administration, and now that we've seen that it's not just Ravi, it's not just Gene. Gene was deported to Haiti. We filed a lawsuit seeking his return as well. That's still pending. It's not just Claudio. Our clinic has now documented over 1,000 instances of retaliation affecting immigrants who've been detained or deported, like Ravi, Gene, and Claudio, as well as people who have experienced other forms of retaliation. I know you, Sejal, have been involved in litigation supporting Mara, an organizer who was placed into removal proceedings because of her advocacy. We work together on supporting sanctuary leaders who are fined hundreds of thousands of dollars because they spoke out about the sanctuary movement. And it's also affected citizens. Many of the cases we've documented involve journalists, lawyers, clergy, all of whom have attempted to speak out, support immigrants, and have faced retaliation in the form of having their ability to cross borders, that their authorization to be revoked, who've been harassed, surveilled, questioned. And in the case of No More Deaths, a humanitarian aid organization working at the border, have been criminally prosecuted. That is the legacy of retaliation, open embrace of obvious retaliation to everyone who looks at it, that the Trump administration has given us. And now it's up to the Biden administration to end it. And to end it, they have to not only announce policies and protocols and implement guidance that really ensures that it's 100% clear that retaliation won't be tolerated. They have to redress the people who've already been affected by it. They have to ICE tried to send a message to the immigrant rights community by deporting Claudio. Speak up and we'll come after you. The only way to counter that message is for the Biden administration to bring Claudio back and say, you speak up, your rights will be protected. We will not stand for this kind of retaliation. Gene Montreville must be brought back from Haiti. The attempts to deport Ravi Ragbear must end. Those are the kinds of actions that we need to see as a community. And it's important now more than ever, because we need immigrant voices to guide us in this next stage. There's lots of talk about legislation, lots of talk about policy changes. We know anti-immigrant forces are speaking out against some of the important positive steps the Biden administration has taken. To overcome that anti-immigrant rhetoric, we need the voices of immigrants to speak out. And they won't be able to do so if they believe that they'll be deported because of it. And so it's a problem that ranges, we've seen it across the country. It affects non-citizens and citizens alike. And more importantly, it affects the very core of our democracy and our ability to have a meaningful debate about what it means to have a humane immigration system.
Thank you, Alina. And I want to just do a little shout out for the sort of interactive map and database that Alina and her students created, documenting 1,000+ cases of retaliation, targeting, surveillance. It's been an incredibly helpful, for those of us who are working in this area, it's been an incredibly helpful tool for advocacy, for litigation. And so I encourage any of you who are working on these issues to know that it's a great resource. So, I want to, so Alina, you got into some of the ways in which, this current administration can try to right this. And you brought up, I am involved in representing La Resistencia and CAR-W in their lawsuit, which is trying to end, all ICE retaliation nationwide. And in the context of that lawsuit, we've been thinking about, what policies do we need in place to make people whole, right? To bring people back, to get people released, but also, what do we need in place to ensure that ICE ends these repressive practices? And so, Claudio, I would love to hear, what you think the Biden administration should do to protect people who speak out from retaliation going forward. And of course, what the administration can do to make people like you whole who were already targeted. Claudio, are you able to speak to that? I'm sorry, I'm not sure if you're hearing me.
Sí, no escuché la pregunta. No se escuchó la pregunta.
Yes. Yeah, so I was just saying, what do you want to see this administration do, to make up for what's happened to you, but also, what can this administration put into place to make sure that this doesn't happen to anyone going forward, so that immigrants are able to speak out freely, so that they're not afraid.
Bueno, como lo dije en un principio, para que el gobierno pueda compensarme a mí, sería regresarme a casa y reunirme con mi familia y recuperar el tiempo que he perdido. Ya hace 2 años, más de 2 años que estoy separado de mi esposa, mis hijos. Tengo 2 hermosos nietos que prácticamente los conozco por la tecnología nada más. Y eso es lo que podría hacer el gobierno para recompensarme todo lo que he vivido y el trauma que me han causado a mí y a mi familia. Y bueno, como dije en un principio, para evitar que el inmigrante pueda expresarse sin tener miedo a la deportación y a abrir la boca tranquilamente, se necesitaría un centro donde ellos puedan ir confiados y hablar sin el temor de que lo van a denunciar y lo van a deportar o lo van a detener. Eso es lo que yo creo que haría falta para el inmigrante poder expresarse libremente.
Thank you. I know our panel is ending, and I just wanted to ask one last question to the 3 of you. As you know, Secretary Mayorkas, the Department of Homeland Secretary Mayorkas, will be interviewed next week as part of this conference. And if you were doing the interview, what would each of you ask Secretary Mayorkas? We're hoping that Ahilan will be taking notes of this and that this will actually be conveyed. So this is your moment.
Claudio, ¿quiere empezar? You want to start, Claudio?
Bueno, la pregunta que le haría yo al señor Mallorca es lo que él haría para evitar todo esto de lo que es las deportaciones. Sabemos que venimos de una administración que hizo su campaña diciendo que iba a deportar 12 millones de inmigrantes y usó esa campaña como arma, donde ahí sacó provecho de esa campaña y empezó a reprimir a aquellos que se levantaba la voz, entonces causando un gran daño tanto en la comunidad y separando muchas de las familias. Entonces yo le preguntaría qué él haría para reinvertir toda esa situación, para que uno se pueda expresar libremente, sin temor de la deportación.
Thank you, Claudio. Luis?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll be quick. I think sort of just what I touched upon earlier today. I think can we get a commitment from DHS to well, one, reduce their presence on the border. I think let's not forget about border militarization, right, and the number of CBP agents, because CBP also sucks. That and commitment to defunding and continuing to keep detention, to not grow detention, right? Like Alina mentioned, there's like 14,000 people. Let's not balloon it up again, right? Let's do everything we can to keep it where it's at and work towards getting rid of some of these facilities.
Alina, you get the last word.
Well, I think I would start by asking Secretary Mayorkas if he will commit to bringing Claudio home and other activists like Claudio, like Jean Montreville, others who've been deported, to bring them home, and to ensure that activists who are here, leaders in our community like Ravi Ragbir and others, are no longer suffering under this retaliation when they're here. And that he can put into place measures into guidance, into in terms of what Claudio was saying, in terms of having a place where people can go when they are afraid of retaliation, to make sure that this never happens again.
Thank you guys. I just want to say I'm big fans, and I really, really appreciate everything that each one of you are doing in our movement today. It's you're my hero, so thank you.
Yeah, thank you all so much for that superb panel. I was taking notes, and the panel gave me so much to reflect on when it comes to advocacy tactics, to the lessons we can learn from history, where the immigrants' rights movement is now. Also, special thanks to Claudio. Thank you very much. I know it's not easy to tell your story. We really do appreciate your taking the time to be with us. I should say, just because I've gotten a lot of texts, I am totally fine. I promise you I'm totally fine. I appreciate the well wishes. I really didn't expect that the trailer would only be like the second most dramatic part of the morning. And I'm just really sorry about the technical failures too. Once that happens to me in my brain, like I can't do anything. And so I'm sorry that the beginning of that got messed up. Very embarrassing. Sorry about that. But thank you all for bearing with it. And thank you again for this wonderful panel. So we'll take a break now. As I said at the beginning, the Zoom will remain live, and we'll return at 12 p.m. California time, about 40 minutes, for our conversation with Cecilia Wang. So thanks very much, everyone. And I think we'll take a break now.